It was raining again. Not the kind that washes things clean, but the kind that soaks through your sleeves and settles in your bones. Grace had just flipped the closed sign on her bakery window when she saw him curled under the awning, knees pulled to chest-soaked denim sticking to pavement. A boy. Maybe 20. Maybe younger. For a moment she froze, her hand still on the doorknob. The rain whispered like a memory. A scarred man, a silent night, a folded towel and a medal by the sink. But this wasn't that. This wasn't Logan. This was someone new, someone cold. And even if the past had left its mark, Grace did what she always did. She opened the door. "Have you ever helped someone?" And wondered later if you should have stay. Because sometimes kindness returns with a medal, and sometimes it doesn't. The boy didn't speak at first, just looked up at Grace like he wasn't sure if she was real. His lips were pale, his hands trembled. The kind of cold that didn't just live in skin. She handed him a brown paper bag with 2 rolls and a wrapped slice of pie. He stared at it for a second, then whispered, "Thank you." His voice cracked halfway through. Grace nodded. "No one should be out in this," she said softly. "You got somewhere to go?" He hesitated, looked away. "I'm heading to Wilton," he mumbled. "It's far, but I'll get there." Grace didn't press, didn't ask for proof, didn't question why his shoes looked 2 sizes too big. She simply stepped aside. "There's a heater in the truck," she said. He blinked, like he hadn't expected the door to stay open this long, and then, slowly, he stood. The rain didn't stop, but neither did she. Inside the truck, the boy sat stiff and quiet. Water dripped from his jacket onto the floor mat. Grace didn't speak. She let the heater hum and the silence settle. After a mile, he cleared his throat. "I used to be in the Marines," he said, eyes fixed ahead. Grace glanced over but said nothing. "Got out a few months ago. Things didn't go the way I thought." She nodded once. "I'm Grace," she offered gently. "Jack," he replied. Another mile passed. He shifted, wincing. She noticed the threadbare seams on his coat, the bruise on his hand. Not fresh, but not old either. "You hungry?" she asked. He hesitated. Then, "Yeah." She pointed to the thermos between them. Soup's still warm. He took it with both hands like it might break. No more questions, no more stories. Just a quiet ride through the rain. And one stranger slowly unfolding. By the time they reached her driveway, the rain had softened. Grace pulled the truck into its usual spot beside the garden fence, now mostly mud. Jack stared out the window like he wasn't sure if he should move. "This is your stop," she said gently. He looked at her confused. "I've got a couch," she added. "A blanket. Dry socks." Jack opened his mouth to speak, then closed it. Instead, he nodded. Inside the house smelled like cinnamon and old wood. Mia peeked from the hallway clutching her beer. Grace gave her a small nod and she padded quietly back to bed. Jack stood awkwardly near the door, dripping. "You can leave your boots there," she said. He did. She handed him a towel, and when their eyes met, there was no gratitude, no shame, just the raw, tired look of someone not used to being offered anything soft. She didn't ask for his story, and he didn't offer it. Grace poured a second mug of tea. Set it on the table without a word. Jack sat across from her shoulders, hunched, both hands wrapped around the cup like it was holding him together. Steam curled upward between them. Outside, the wind knocked softly against the window. He didn't drink right away, just stared at the table. "I'm not who you think I am," he said quietly. Grace didn't flinch. "I didn't think anything," she replied. He looked up, eyes rimmed red. "You should," he muttered. "Most people do." She shook her head. "I only think you're cold and tired." Jack blinked as if the simplicity of her answer unsettled him more than suspicion ever could. The room stayed quiet. No confessions, no judgment, just the sound of tea cooling between 2 people who, for now, asked nothing of each other. And maybe that was enough. Later that night, Jack lay on the couch wrapped in a patchwork quilt that smelled faintly of lavender and flower. Grace stood in the kitchen rinsing mugs in silence. The drawer beside her hand creaked open. Inside, a folded towel, an old letter, and the silver coin Logan once left behind. Her fingers brushed the edge of the coin, but she didn't take it out. She closed the drawer slowly. Not everything needed remembering right now. She turned off the light and stood for a moment in the quiet. The sound of rain had softened now, only a hush against the roof. Jack hadn't asked for anything, hadn't even finished the soup, but he hadn't left, and that in itself felt like a kind of permission. Grace whispered into the dark more to herself than anyone, one night. That's all. She believed it, at least for now. Morning came slow and gray. Grace moved quietly through the kitchen, the floor creaking beneath familiar steps. The couch was still occupied. Jack lay curled on his side, one hand tucked under his chin, breathing steady. She didn't wake him. Instead, she set 2 slices of bread in the toaster, brewed coffee, and cracked the kitchen window just wide enough to let in the scent of wet earth. The rain had stopped, but its weight still lingered in the air. Mia tiptoed in, rubbing her eyes. "Is the soldier still here?" she whispered. Grace smiled softly. "He's just someone passing through," she said. Mia nodded, like that made perfect sense. Sometimes the smallest people understand the most. The toast popped. Jack stirred. Grace poured an extra cup, set it down without looking up. No questions, no pressure. Just a seat at the table if he chose to take it. Jack sat at the table, hair still damp from sleep. He held the coffee like it might warm something deeper than his hands. Grace slid a plate toward him, toast butter, a few strawberries from the garden. He looked at it too long, as if unsure it was really for him. Then quietly, "You don't have to do this." Grace didn't look up. "I know." He picked up a strawberry, turned it between his fingers. "They used to bring fruit to the ward sometimes, mostly canned." His voice softened, almost like talking to himself. "This is the first fresh one I've had in, I don't know, a while." Grace just nodded, wiping the counter with slow, even strokes. "Eat while it's still sweet," she said. Jack smiled faintly, almost apologetically. There was a silence then, but not the kind that presses. Just the kind that allows things to breathe. After breakfast, Jack stood near the door, backpack slung over one shoulder. "I can head out now," he said. "Didn't mean to overstay." Grace shook her head. "No rush. Roads are still wet. Let them dry." Jack hesitated, thumb grazing the frayed strap of his bag. "I don't want to take advantage." "You haven't," Grace replied. Her tone was steady, kind, but final. She handed him a clean pair of socks. Still warm from the dryer, she added. Jack looked at them like they were something sacred. Then, quietly, "You remind me of someone. My aunt, maybe, before things got bad." Grace didn't ask what bad meant. Didn't need to. She just nodded once, then turned back toward the sink. Behind her, Jack sat back down slower this time. Not like a guest. More like someone beginning to remember what it felt like. To belong even briefly. That afternoon, Grace baked. Not for the bakery, just for the rhythm of it. Flour on her hands, dough beneath her palms, the comfort of something rising slowly on its own time. Jack offered to help. She handed him a bowl and a wooden spoon. He stirred in silence, shoulders looser than they'd been that morning. "Used to help my mom make cornbread," he said, eyes on the batter. She'd hum the same song every time. I can't remember the words, but the tune's still there. Grace didn't interrupt, didn't reach for the moment. Just let it come and go. The oven ticked warm behind them. Mia giggled from the other room, lost in her crayons and a paper sun. And for a breath of time the house didn't feel like a stopover. It felt lived in. Held. And Jack, without realizing it, had begun to take up space without apology. That evening, after Mia went to bed, Grace sat at the kitchen table with a cup of chamomile. Jack lingered near the doorway as if unsure whether to speak or let the silence settle. He finally stepped forward, fingers wrapped around a chipped mug. "She seems happy," he said, nodding toward Mia's closed door. Grace smiled faintly. "She is. Kids don't need much just to feel safe." Jack looked down, turning the mug slowly. "Didn't always feel that way growing up," he said. "Safe, I mean." His voice wasn't bitter, just tired. Grace didn't pry. Instead, she said, "Sometimes safety doesn't come from walls. Sometimes it's just knowing someone won't walk away. Jack glanced at her like he wanted to believe that, and maybe, just maybe for the first time in a long while, he did. Outside, the rain had returned gentle now, like something learning how to fall without breaking. The next morning, Grace found Jack already awake, sitting quietly on the porch with a blanket over his shoulders. The sky was overcast, but the air smelled like thaw mud leaves, the hint of something trying to begin again. He didn't turn when she stepped outside, just sipped slowly from a mug she hadn't poured. "I made coffee," he said. Grace sat beside him, folding her hands in her lap. They watched a bird land on the fence post wings, still head tilted. "I've been clean for 4 months," Jack said suddenly. No lead-up, no hesitation. Grace didn't speak right away. When she did, it was soft. That's something to be proud of. Jack's fingers tightened around the mug. Not everyone sees it that way. She looked at him, then, not with pity, not with praise, just a kind, steady gaze. "Well," she said, "you're not everyone." And somehow that landed deeper than anything else. Later that day, Jack helped Grace carry groceries in from the truck. It was a small thing. 2 bags, a carton of eggs, a loaf of day-old bread, but he held them like they mattered. Inside, he placed everything gently on the counter, careful not to break anything. Grace handed him a dish towel. He dried each item as she washed them, quiet, steady. It wasn't about the food. It was the rhythm of shared motion, the kind that says, "I'm here and I'm trying." At one point, he reached for a glass one with a tiny chip on the rim and paused. "You want me to toss this?" Grace shook her head. "No, it still holds." Jack looked at her eyes unreadable. Then he set it on the drying rack like it belonged. And maybe in that moment he understood she wasn't just talking about the glass. Some things stay useful even after they break. That evening, Mia brought out her crayons and sat cross-legged on the floor. She didn't say much, just started drawing, humming a tune Grace didn't recognize. Jack watched from the kitchen table, still nursing his second cup of coffee. After a while, Mia held up her picture. 3 stick figures. 1 tall, 1 smaller, 1 in a green hat. She pointed. "This one's you," she said to Jack. He blinked, caught off guard. "You gave me your toast," she added simply, as if that was enough to earn a place in her world. He stared at the paper, not smiling, not crying, just quiet, like something inside him didn't know how to receive even that small kind of acceptance. Grace glanced over, caught the look on his face. She didn't say anything, just went back to folding laundry, letting the moment settle soft and unannounced. Sometimes love arrives in crayon lines. After Mia went to bed, Jack stayed at the table, her drawing still in his hands. His thumb traced the lines like they might disappear. Grace refilled the kettle, the click of the stove the only sound between them. "I didn't expect to stay this long," Jack said quietly. Grace didn't look up. "Most people don't," she replied. He set the picture down gently like it might break. "I've left a lot of places. Burned a few bridges, too." She finally met his eyes. "This isn't a bridge," she said. "It's a kitchen table." Jack let out something between a laugh and a breath, like he wasn't sure if he deserved the warmth he was sitting in. "Still feels like more than I've earned." Grace folded the dish towel in her hands. "Kindness doesn't ask what you've earned. It asks what you need." And Jack had no answer, only the quiet. The next morning, Grace walked into the living room and found Jack folding the blanket from the couch. His backpack was zipped. Shoes by the door. She didn't say anything right away. He looked up, caught in the act. "I figured I'd head out," he said. "Didn't want to overstay." Grace nodded slowly, then glanced out the window. Clouds still low, the air damp with last night's fog. "You sure you're ready for another long walk?" Jack gave a half smile. "I've done worse on worse days." She walked past him, picked up a paper bag from the counter. Leftovers. Some of Mia's crayons, too. She insisted. He took the bag, a little surprised. "She's got a good heart." Grace looked at him steady. She gets it from being seen, even when she's small. Jack looked away, and for the first time it was hard to meet kindness head-on. Maybe that was the real weight he carried. Jack stood at the door, hand on the knob bag slung over his shoulder. Grace waited behind him, not rushing, not holding him back, just present. He opened the door. Cool air drifted in, carrying the scent of wet leaves and gravel. He paused, turned halfway. "Thanks," he said, voice rough but honest. Grace gave a soft nod. No need. But Jack lingered. "I mean, not just for the food, or the couch," he swallowed, "for not asking too many questions." She met his gaze, quiet and steady. "Sometimes we don't need answers, just room to be human." Jack stepped outside. The gravel crunched under his boots. He didn't look back, but Grace watched the road until he disappeared behind the trees. Then she closed the door gently, as if anything louder might shake something loose inside her, because letting someone go kindly still leaves a space, and she felt it, right where silence usually lives. The house felt different without him. Not empty, just quieter in a way Grace noticed more than she expected. The couch was neatly made. The extra mug rinsed and drying by the sink. Even the folded blanket held the shape of someone who'd tried not to leave a mark. Mia tugged at Grace's sleeve after breakfast. "Will he come back?" Grace knelt beside her. "I don't know," she said gently. "Did he forget his picture?" Mia held up the crayon drawing the green hat figure smudged at the edges. Grace looked at it a long time. "No," she said softly. "I think he took it with him, just not in his hands." Mia seemed satisfied, wandering back to her crayons, and Grace, standing there alone in the kitchen, realized, some people leave behind silence, others leave weight, and Jack somehow had left both. Before heading back inside, Grace noticed something out of place. The folded blanket Jack had used was now perfectly squared on the couch, tighter than she remembered leaving it. And on top of it a small dried flower rested, one of the garden's wild daisies. She hadn't picked it. Mia hadn't either. Grace didn't touch it, just looked. It wasn't a message, but it was something. The kind of gesture that says, "I was here, I saw this place," and it meant something. Later that day, Grace walked past the hall drawer and paused. She opened it slowly, almost without thinking. Inside sat the things she rarely touched: Logan's letter, the challenge coin, the purple heart. She moved them gently aside and placed something new. A small, folded paper bag, empty, but still holding the shape of what had been inside. Jack hadn't left anything behind. No note, no thank you, but Grace wasn't looking for those things. She placed the bag beside Logan's coin, not as a statement, but as a small truth. Kindness doesn't measure outcomes. It simply makes room. She closed the drawer, her hand resting on it for a moment longer than needed. Then she exhaled the kind of breath you take when you've done what's right, even if it leaves you with questions, even if it leaves you alone. Sometimes kindness is the only story that doesn't ask for an ending. That evening, Grace stood at the sink peeling carrots for soup. The radio played low, an old song with no words, just soft guitar. The kind of melody that doesn't interrupt thoughts, just walks alongside them. Her hands moved on instinct, but her mind drifted to the porch, to the folded blanket, to the way Jack looked when he said thank you like it was a foreign word. Not dramatic, not broken, just unfamiliar. She'd seen that look before. On Logan. On herself, once. That quiet ache of being offered something you don't think you deserve. Grace didn't believe in saving people, but she believed in softness, in one warm meal, one safe night. She dropped the carrots into the pot, steam rising. The window fogged. Outside, the wind moved the last of the leaves across the gravel, and in that small, unspoken moment, everything felt exactly as it should. The next morning, Grace stepped out to get the mail. The air was sharp, the sky a quiet gray. A few catalogs, a bill, and an envelope without a return address. Her name was written in small, careful print. Nothing rushed, nothing official. She opened it on the porch, her fingers stiff from the cold. Inside, one sentence, handwritten in block letters. "Thank you for letting me be nobody for a while." No name, no signature, just that. Grace stared at it for a long moment, then folded it back along its original crease. She didn't need to wonder who sent it. Some notes don't require confirmation. They land where they're supposed to. She tucked it into her coat pocket and walked back inside the door, clicking gently behind her. Sometimes closure isn't an answer. Sometimes it's just the space to exhale without needing more. Grace placed the letter in the drawer beside Logan's coin and the faded towel he once left folded. Not as something sacred, just part of the pattern now. A quiet line of stories she didn't chase but still carried. That afternoon, Nora stopped by with a basket of lemons and a full opinion. "He's gone, huh?" Grace nodded. Nora sighed. "I hope he was worth the worry. You barely slept." Grace smiled faintly. "He didn't take anything, that you know of." Grace looked down at her hands. "He took a second chance. That's more than most ever pick up." Nora scoffed but softened. "You always see the good first." Grace didn't argue. Didn't need to. There are things you defend, and things that defend themselves by simply being true. She changed the subject, poured tea. But her chest felt lighter, not because she was sure, but because she'd acted without needing to be. The next few days passed quietly. Grace returned to her usual rhythm, early mornings at the bakery, evenings folding laundry, tucking Mia into sleep. But something had shifted. Not in her routine, but in the spaces between it. She found herself checking the road a little more often, lingering at the porch longer than necessary. Not out of hope, just habit. The kind formed when someone's absence still hums around a room. One evening, while straightening shelves, she noticed the coin was missing from the drawer. Panic rose for a moment, sharp, quick. But then she remembered she'd moved it. Placed it near the kitchen window beside the photo of Mia in rain boots laughing. Not for display, just so it could catch the light. Some reminders weren't meant to be hidden, just quiet and close. Like memory. Like grace. Like someone still learning how to stay even after they've gone. That Friday, the bakery was quiet, just a few regulars, the usual hum of the mixer and back. Grace stood behind the counter tying boxes when a man stepped in. Tall, mid-40s, worn denim jacket. He didn't order, just looked around, then said, "You, Grace, Bennett." She nodded, cautious but calm. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a folded note. "Jack asked me to give you this. Said if I passed through Maple Hollow, I'd know who to find." He placed it gently on the counter. No smile, no explanation. Then he turned and left. Grace waited until the door shut, then opened the note. Only one line. Still clean. Still walking. Still grateful. No signature. No return address. But her throat tightened anyway. Because sometimes knowing someone is still out there, still trying, is the closest thing we get to a happy ending. And sometimes it's enough. That night, Grace sat alone at the kitchen table. The lights were low. The note lay open beside her tea. She traced the words with her fingertip, not to memorize them, she already had, but to feel their weight again. Still clean. Still walking. Still grateful. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even closure. But it was movement. And in a world where people vanish, drift, disappear without reason. Jack's words were a small anchor. She folded the paper, slid it into the drawer with the others. Not a shrine. Not a record. Just proof that something had once passed through her life softly, briefly, and left more than it took. The wind picked up outside. Grace turned off the light and walked down the hallway where Mia was already asleep. And as she pulled the door gently closed, she whispered to no one in particular. Still grateful, too. Saturday morning came with light frost and a sky the color of milk. Grace bundled Mia in her jacket and boots, then stepped out to check the small garden by the fence. The lettuce had wilted overnight. A few carrots still held firm beneath the soil. She knelt to pull them hands steady in the cold. Behind her, Mia asked Will, "Jack, come for soup again?" Grace paused, dirt under her nails. "I don't know, honey," she said. "Maybe not." Mia didn't seem sad, just thoughtful. "Then we can save him a bowl, just in case." Grace smiled soft and full. Just in case, she echoed. They picked quietly after that, and when they went back inside, Grace set one extra bowl on the shelf. Not labeled, not promised, but waiting. Because kindness once offered sometimes lingers in small places like kitchen shelves and children's questions and the quiet hope that someone might still come back. Later that afternoon, Grace visited the corner thrift shop. Not for anything in particular, just to walk to feel the world hum again. She browsed slowly, fingers trailing across worn books, mismatched mugs, and a basket of tangled scarves. Near the back, tucked between old jackets, she found it. A green wool hat frayed at the edge, sun-faded, almost familiar. She picked it up, held it gently. Not his, she was sure, but close enough to stir something. Not grief, not even longing, just the quiet recognition of something once known. She didn't buy it, didn't need to. Some things aren't meant to be taken home, only noticed. As she left, the woman at the register smiled. Find what you needed. Grace returned the smile. Not exactly, she said, but I remembered something I didn't know I'd forgotten, and sometimes that's just as valuable. Sometimes it's even more. That evening, Grace sat by the window, hands wrapped around a cup of tea, gone lukewarm. Outside, the porch light cast soft gold across the steps, catching the outline of boots she'd swept earlier. The house was quiet. Mia asleep, the radio off, the world between things. Grace didn't need noise. She needed stillness. She thought about how easily people pass through your life, some like wind, others like rain. Jack had been both. She reached into the drawer beside her and pulled out Mia's drawing. The crayon lines had smudged slightly, colors softening at the edges. She smoothed it flat, placed it beneath a magnet on the fridge. Not decoration, just memory made visible. A boy in a green hat, hand in hand with two stick figures. No names, no date. But love doesn't always come with a timestamp. Sometimes it just stays quiet and unnamed but felt. Always felt. Sunday came with early light and the promise of nothing urgent. Grace stood at the kitchen counter slicing apples for pie. The rhythm calmed her peel, turn, slice, repeat. Mia sat at the table coloring again. She looked up suddenly. Mom, how do you know if someone's good? Grace? Paused, the knife resting on the cutting board. I don't think it's about knowing, she said after a moment. It's about choosing to believe, even if you're not sure. Mia considered that, then went back to her drawing without another word. Grace returned to the apples slower now. She wasn't sure when Jack would come back, if ever, but she'd chosen to believe in him not because of proof, but because belief was the only thing she knew how to give without running out. And maybe, just maybe, that was its own kind of strength. A quiet faith folded into everyday things. That night, after Mia had gone to bed and the dishes were done, Grace sat at the kitchen table with the lights low. The pie had cooled on the counter untouched. She wasn't hungry, just thinking. She opened the drawer again, not to take anything but to look. The notes, the coin, the empty bag, the letter. Each one small, ordinary. But together they told a story she didn't fully understand and maybe wasn't meant to. Grace ran her fingers over the edges, careful not to unfold them. She wasn't chasing closure. She was learning to live in the space without it. A kind of quiet honesty. Some people leave and all you're left with is silence. Others leave and somehow their absence keeps teaching you things. She closed the drawer softly, then turned off the light. And in the dark she whispered, not to be heard, but because it still mattered, to say, "Be safe wherever you are." Monday brought rain again. Not heavy, just a steady tap against the windows, familiar, almost comforting. Grace walked Mia to school under one umbrella, their boots splashing through shallow puddles. At the gate, Mia looked up. "Do you think Jack hears rain the same way we do?" Grace smiled softly. Maybe even more. Mia nodded, like that made perfect sense. Then ran toward her classroom. Grace stood there for a moment watching her go, the umbrella trembling slightly in her hand. On the walk home she passed the small diner near Main Street. A paper sign hung in the window. Help wanted. Short-term evenings. She didn't need another job, but something about it pulled at her. Not for money, just to be near people. She stepped inside. The bell above the door chimed low, and a familiar scent, coffee and old linoleum, welcomed her. Sometimes healing looks like returning to the world slowly, one small shift at a time. The manager at the diner was a woman in her 50s named Helen. She wore her hair pulled back and spoke with the kind of voice that had softened over years of repeating kindness to strangers. "We're not fancy," she said, handing Grace a faded apron. "But we keep the coffee warm and the lights on." Grace nodded. That was enough. Her first shift was quiet, just a few regulars, a couple passing through town. She refilled mugs, wiped tables, listened. No one knew her story. No one asked. And for the first time in a while, that felt like Grace. A man in the corner left a tip folded into a napkin. A teenager thanked her for a refill without looking up. These weren't big moments, but they stacked gently like bricks in something being rebuilt. Not from loss, but from what remained. And Grace walked home that night tired, but steadier, as if she'd rejoined something quietly human. The walk home was quiet, just streetlights, wet pavement, and the soft sound of Grace's footsteps. She didn't rush, didn't check her phone, just breathed in the night like something she hadn't tasted in a while. At her door, she paused. Something felt different. Not wrong, just out of place. She opened it slowly. The house was still. Mia asleep, the kitchen dark, everything as it should be. Except a small paper bag sat on the table. Unlabeled, folded shut. She reached for it with careful hands, opened it slowly. Inside, a worn deck of playing cards, rubber-banded, and a tiny note that simply said, "Thanks for the quiet." Her throat tightened. She didn't need to guess. Jack had been there. Briefly. Gently. The way only someone who understood silence would be. She stood there a while, not smiling, not crying, just receiving the moment like a gift that didn't want to be unwrapped too fast. Grace placed the deck of cards beside the old coin on the windowsill. Not as decoration, just somewhere visible. Somewhere honest. She stood there a long time. Arms crossed the soft hum of the fridge behind her. She didn't hear him come in. Just the creak of the back door, slow and deliberate. Jack. No announcement. No apology. Just him. Wearing the same jacket, a little more worn. He looked older, calmer. Grace didn't speak. She didn't need to. Jack nodded once like they had an understanding neither wanted to put into words. "I didn't want to wake her," he said. "She sleeps deep," Grace replied. They stood in the kitchen like two people who'd survived separate storms and now shared the same dry floor. Jack pulled something from his pocket. A small, stone-smooth, dark river washed. He placed it on the table. "For the drawer," he said. And Grace understood exactly what he meant. They sat at the table, the clock ticking soft in the background. Jack held his mug with both hands, steam curling into the quiet. I didn't take anything he said after a while. Grace looked at him steady, not searching. "I know." He nodded, eyes down. "But I wanted to. Not your money, just the feeling." She waited. He breathed in slow. I'd forgotten what stillness felt like, what it meant to be somewhere and not be measured. Grace's voice was quiet, but full. "Not everything has to be earned, Jack. Some things are just given." He blinked once. Hard. The kind of blink people do when holding back too much. Outside, the wind rustled the porch light chain. Inside, Jack set the mug down carefully. "Thank you for not asking who I was back then." Grace reached across the table, touched the rim of the cup. "You were someone worth letting in. That's all I needed to know." Jack leaned back slightly, eyes still on the table. "I used to lie about being in the military," he said, voice low, but even. "It got me a meal sometimes, a place to sleep." Grace didn't interrupt. "I thought if I said it enough, maybe I'd become someone people wanted to help." He paused, breathing through the weight of it. "But here, you didn't ask for medals. You didn't need a story. You just gave." Grace sat quietly, hands folded. "You're not the first to pretend they were stronger than they were," she said, "and you won't be the last." Jack's mouth tightened, not in shame, just in truth. "I never wanted to be forgiven," he said. "I just didn't want to disappear." Grace met his eyes. "You didn't." And in that moment between a lie once told and a truth now shared, the room felt lighter. Like something had finally come home. The rain returned that night, soft at first, then steady, familiar as breath. Jack stayed on the couch, same blanket, same quiet posture. But something in the way he rested was different now. Not like a guest. More like someone who trusted the roof above him. Grace turned off the kitchen light and stood at the doorway for a moment, watching him sleep. His shoulders had softened, the lines around his mouth not so sharp. She didn't feel pity. She felt presence, a recognition that sometimes healing isn't loud, it's just the absence of tension where it used to live. She walked down the hall and checked on Mia, who was curled beneath her blanket, one hand holding the drawing she'd never taken off the fridge. 3 figures. Still there, still whole. Grace whispered goodnight to them both, one awake, one dreaming, then closed the door behind her with the gentleness of someone who finally understood what it means to stay. Morning light crept slowly across the floorboards, warming the edges of the kitchen. Grace brewed coffee, moving with quiet ease. Jack was already up, sitting on the porch with Mia beside him, 2 mismatched shapes side by side, sharing a silence that didn't ask for anything. She handed him a mug, then sat on the step without a word. Mia held a dandelion already gone to seed. "Make a wish," she said, holding it toward Jack. He hesitated, then blew gently, watching the pieces scatter into the breeze. "What did you wish for?" she asked. Jack didn't answer right away. "Then I didn't." Mia looked up. "Why not?" He smiled, soft and honest. "Because sometimes, just being here is enough." Grace looked at him, then, not as a stranger, not even as a guest, but as someone who had returned not for shelter, but for the space to belong. And this time he did. That afternoon, Grace pulled an extra chair onto the porch. Not because they needed it, just because it felt right. Jack helped Mia water the garden, careful with the hose, mindful of the fragile stems. When they were done, he knelt beside the soil, fingertips pressing gently into the dirt. "It's soft," he said. Grace nodded. "Things grow better when they don't have to fight so hard." Jack looked up at her. "I never thought I'd come back." "You didn't have to," she said. "But you did." He sat back on his heels, wiping his hands on his jeans. "I still don't know where I'm going next." Grace handed him a glass of water. "That's all right. You're here now." He took it and for the first time didn't look like he owed her anything for it. Just accepted it, like sunlight, like belonging, like something he no longer had to earn. That evening, Grace stood in the doorway, watching the light fade over the yard. Jack sat on the steps with Mia, teaching her how to shuffle the old deck of cards he'd once left behind. She laughed when they spilled, and he didn't mind. The sound drifted up like wind through trees' honest, unpolished hole. Grace smiled, not because anything miraculous had happened, but because something simple had stayed. Not all stories end with grand gestures. Some end with someone coming back, sitting still, trying again. In the drawer beside the coin, the notes, and the stone, she placed one more thing, a small slip of paper written in her own hand. It read, "Kindness doesn't ask who you've been. It makes room for who you're becoming." And as the porch light flicked on behind her, Grace knew sometimes the quietest good is the kind that lasts longest. Stay, believe, give anyway. Thank you for staying, for listening, and for believing in the quiet kind of good. If this story stayed with you, even just a little, we hope you'll share it with someone who might need reminding that kindness still matters. Your presence here made Part 2 possible, and if you'd like to walk with us into what comes next, we'll be right here waiting. Until then, stay warm, stay kind, stay human.